So this last video is on actually using the quadratic formula. So here we see the quadratic formula. It says the solutions to the quadratic equation given here, assuming a is not equal to 0. So this is just here because if a was 0, I wouldn't have a quadratic, so I couldn't use the quadratic formula. So here is the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And a funny story is a few years back I made a video about this and I sang the song and someone put me on Twitter singing it or Instagram or something like that, so I'm not going to sing it. So we're going to try our first one. Using the quadratic formula shown above, solve this equation, 1x squared plus 12x plus 18. So first I identify my a value, which is 1, my b value, which is 12, and my c value, which is 18. And even if these two terms were switched and it wasn't in standard form, the number that's with x is always b, and the number by itself is always c, and a is the number that's with the x squared. So plugging those numbers in, my b value is 12, so I'm going to write negative 12 plus or minus the square root. B squared would be 12 squared minus 4 times 1 times 18. And that's all over 2 times the a value, which is 1. So the most important thing, the most common spot for mistakes is not finding this number under the radical correctly. So I'm going to put a little rectangle around it, and you want to type that in as you see it without the square root to get to the next step. So if I type that in, let's just write down the parts that stay the same. If I type that number in, I would get 72. Okay, so now we're to what we saw in the last video about how to simplify these results that we get. So this one, I look at it, I can simplify my radical. The biggest perfect square that goes into 72 is 36. So that's the one I want to use. So this is 36 times 2. Okay. So now this is going to become 6. So I'm running out of room a little bit. We'll make it work. So I have negative 12 plus or minus 6 radical 2 over 2. Only now, once I have that radical simplified, can I start to look for a number that I can cancel from each of those 3 terms. So if I look, 2 goes into each of them. So I'm going to divide the negative 12 by 2 would give me negative 6. This is going to become a 3, and this one's going to become a 1. I'm just going to scroll down the page a little bit, so I have to walk over to my computer. So final answer here is negative 6. And I'm actually going to bring my answer over here so we have it in the right spot. Negative 6 plus or minus 3 radical 2. I don't have to write the over 1 because that doesn't really make a difference in the answer. So if I was going to write these as 2 separate answers, the first answer is negative 6 minus 3 radical 2. And the second answer is negative 6 plus 3 radical 2. Now, these look really weird, but those are actual answers. If I type them in, I would get a decimal for each one. I just leave them as radicals to have that exact answer. So the next question says, how can you tell from your solutions that the quadratic equation x squared plus 12x plus 18 equals 0 is not factorable? So basically, if my solutions are irrational, if they have radicals left in them, square roots, then I couldn't have factored. So the answer to this is my answers are irrational. So if we see those square roots, I don't think we've ever really factored and gotten answers that are square roots. It means we couldn't have factored in the first place. The next question, though, we have a different quadratic that can be solved by factoring, and we're going to show that the quadratic formula gives us the same answer. So I actually suggest pausing the video on this one, trying this one, and then coming back and checking it. Okay, so hopefully you've tried both of these, A and B. So if I'm going to solve this by factoring, I notice that the A is greater than 1 in this trinomial. So I need to find numbers that add up to 11 and multiply to negative 12. Okay, so those two numbers that will work are positive 12, so plus 12x, and negative 1. I'm going to move that over a little bit. Okay, so now we're ready to group because we have our 4 terms. So I take out my 2x and I have x plus 6 left. I take out my negative 1 and I have another x plus 6 left. So looking at both of these, my common binomial factor now is x plus 6. And then I have 2x minus 1. So then I'm going to solve each of these. If I have x plus 6 equals 0, that's going to give me an answer of negative 6. And 2x minus 1 equals 0 is going to give me an answer of positive 1 over 2. So we saw that quadratic was factorable, and now we're going to try solving that same quadratic with the quadratic formula. So I have x equals, and we're going to lay out our a, b, and c values. We're going to plug those in. So my negative b would be negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 6. All over 2a would be 2 times 2. So if I take this number under the radical, which is known as the discriminant, and type it in my calculator, you get that part. So we're going to copy down the part that stays the same. So we have negative 11 plus or minus over 4, and here's my square root. And if I type that in, this is 169. Now, 169 isn't a common square root like 25 that you necessarily know, but the square root of 169, it is a perfect square, so the answer is 13. So right now I have negative 11 plus or minus 13 over 4. Now, since everything's rational, the square roots are gone, I can continue simplifying that more, and I actually simplify it by splitting it up into 2 different answers. So I have negative 11 minus 13 over 4, and negative 11 plus 13 over 4. So negative 11 minus 13 over 4 equals negative 6. And negative 11 plus 13, that's 2 over 4, is 1/2. So those are my 2 answers, and I see that they're the same exact answers I had when I was factoring. So factoring is a method that works sometimes. Quadratic formula works all the time, even if factoring was possible. So let's look at the last 2 problems on the page. I'm actually going to just do letter A to keep this video kind of short. I'm going to write an answer for B down. So if you decide to do it, you can check it. So for B, it's 4 plus or minus radical 3. Okay. To keep the video a little shorter, we're just going to do 4A. Everything you need to know is in the problems you've seen, and then this one. So here, what's slightly different is my B value is negative, so that means I have to be a little extra careful when I work with the quadratic formula. So first off, negative B is going to be negative 2. Now, if you recognize that's positive 2 right off the bat, you can write that. Here is the most common error. When you square a negative number on a calculator, you have to put it in parentheses or it will not become positive. So that's negative 2 squared for B squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5. Okay. All over 2 times 2. So moving on to the next step for this one, right, this becomes a positive 2. We're going to type this part in our calculator, discriminant, and that's going to give us 44. So I have 2 plus or minus the square root of 44 over 4. Now, if you had typed that in and you didn't put the negative 2 in parentheses, you would have gotten the square root of 36 there. Okay, so if that's what you got, that means you didn't put the -2 in parentheses right here. So it's super tempting, just as a side note, to say, oh, I got 44 and 4 and 2. That's great. I can simplify it. This number right here is not really 44. Okay, that's the square root of 44, which is a totally different value. So until you bring a number out of the square root, you cannot simplify it further. So this is 2 plus or minus. The perfect square that goes into 44 is 4. So that's 4 and 11 over 4. So taking this one step further, we get 2 plus or minus 2 radical 11 over 4. And now we're ready to simplify. So my common factor is 2. This becomes a 1. This becomes a 1. And that becomes a 2. Now, adding 1 to something does change its value. So I definitely need to write that one. I can't just throw it out. Like if you remember when I had a 1 in the denominator, I didn't have to write it because dividing by 1 doesn't change something. I could write this one as 1 radical 11, but I'm just going to write radical 11 and then over 2. So on delta math, if you were entering this answer, you would want to do 1 minus radical 11 over 2 and 1 plus radical 11 over 2. So you have to enter them as those two separate answers. So just make sure you're aware of that. Now, one thing that didn't come up in these problems was I didn't have a radical that stopped, that didn't simplify. But let's say I had a 10 in here, or I had a 37 in there. They have no perfect squares that go into them, so I would have been done right at this stop. Okay? When you do the questions, make sure you take your time. You have to be pretty careful. Quadratic formula is very straightforward, but you can make little silly errors as you're simplifying.